Hello, good afternoon, perhaps good morning, maybe even good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Very happy to have you here. For those who don't, I haven't met, my name's Ken Shopman. I'm ABRF's Executive Director. I just have a couple of housekeeping and an event and announcements to share with you, and then we'll turn it over to Rich Cole and Ron Orlando for today's program. So just set up that share. Hopefully you can see this slide. Again, we'll handle questions in the chat. So, but if you'd like to introduce yourself in chat, can tell us where you're connecting from in your institution. We'd love to learn more about you as well. So that would be great. Rich and Ron will take questions towards the end of the program. So please use chat for that. We'll have some polls and other ways for you to engage throughout the program as well. If you have suggestions for future programs, please send us an email, abrf@abrf.org, and we'd be happy to pass those on. Some calendar updates. For the rest of this month, we have a couple of other programs, including next week's preview of the 2026 annual meeting. Members of the committee will be talking about some of the key sessions and really the reasons they're looking forward to being together in Pittsburgh at the end of March. So if you have time, please join us for that. It will also be recorded and shared. And then our DEIB Council will present the first of their quarterly series this year on bystander intervention. The ABRF chapters also have events that are being finalized throughout the rest of the year. You can mark your calendars for these. As their registration process moves forward, of course, everyone will be notified when registration is available for the chapter meetings. We wanted to share with you some recent decisions made by the executive board to help expand and improve access to the meeting. First of all, we will not be increasing registration fees, which were due to go up at the end of this week, and then again at the end of February. Those will stay at their current early rate, so that gives you an opportunity to save a little bit. For those of you who are individual members of ABRF, you can also bundle or package your ABRF membership renewal and save even more. I hope you've seen that the opportunity to submit a poster to present at the meeting has also been extended through January 28th. So you'll find that link again on the ABRF website, the meeting website, and please take advantage of that. It's an opportunity to present either a research poster or a poster about a unique or novel method or program used in your research facility. So it's not just simply those of you who might work on fundamental research, but also a chance for you to talk about the work in your facilities as well. All right. And again, we also have pre-meeting workshops that are typically very popular. These require a little bit of adjustment on your schedule. You can scan the QR code to learn more about these full and half-day programs, which have typically been very popular on different aspects of working within course. A new facet of the meeting that we piloted last year, actually driven by this group, that we're expanding for the current year is mini workshops. And these are effectively double length sessions. So about 2.5 hours of learning time with a little networking break in between on these specific topic areas. So these are intended to be more hands-on with a higher level of takeaways. It's not simply listening to speakers talk at you, but really working with your counterparts, your participants in the room, as well as facilitators in the session to learn more about these topics according to this schedule. So again, please review the website to learn more about the details, the speakers, and objectives for these sessions. This is the new ABRF strategy launched last year. We have task forces that'll be in touch with you about the different programs and objectives that they'll be pursuing to try to help us provide more education programs, more opportunities for you to connect with one another within ABRF, and eventually looking to develop standards or best practices that your facility could demonstrate being a part of, and credentialing opportunities for you to demonstrate your proficiency within different skills and abilities in core facilities. Here's another view of those strategies. All of this is also available on the website, of course. With that, I will stop and turn it over to Rich Cole, the organizer of today's program. Rich?
Thanks, Ken. Hopefully everyone can see my slides here. So for today, the hat I'm wearing is I'm Associate Editor for Education for JBT. And as Ken mentioned, we're going to do polls throughout this webinar. And my hope for the polls is actually twofold. One is to kind of get a flavor of who's attending and where they're at. And the other one is I hope that you'll see that you might not be the only one who's never published a paper who struggles with this. So with that, I'm going to ask Ken to put up the first poll, and then I'll go into a little bit more of my background after that. So we'll take about 30 seconds or so to basically for you guys to fill out this poll. And then Ken, after about 30 seconds, if you could just put the results up, that would be fantastic.
We've heard from nearly everyone, so we'll just give it 5 more seconds. And we will end that and share the results.
Okay, so this is pretty much what I would have expected. I saw some names on basically the list of people, who are my colleagues and stuff. So I'm not surprised that a bunch of people have. But if you look at the second question, which is, would you like to be the first author? Almost 100% said yes, 88%. So, that just shows that, people really want this. So, what's the value? So basically, my key insight from this is that science isn't finished until it's published. Now, if I can get this to advance. Oh. So this is my first paper, and a little bit of my background is I came to the Wadsworth Center, which is part of the New York State Department of Health, in 1985, right out of grad school. And what you'll see is I didn't publish my first author paper until 1988. It was 3 years later. Now, what you also have to, if you're good at math, realize is that I've been a researcher for more than 40 years. And in that time, I've published over 65 peer-reviewed papers, including a science and nature paper, written book chapters, and such like that. So when I look at this first paper that I did, I do cringe a little bit at the title and some of the stuff in there, and you'll see why when we go through some of the slides that I've updated. Now, what I'm going to do, which is kind of unusual, is I'm going to kind of give you the takeaway or the basically the punchline of this webinar. So we are going to go into how to write the scientific paper, the different parts of it, especially on the technical side. But really, the punchline is that we now through JBT have a bunch of more senior people that are willing to partner with you to help you write that first paper. And when I say partner with you, I don't mean review it like once it's done. I'm talking about actually helping you, with the figures, with, some of the context and stuff like that. Now, those of you who know me know that I'm an imager. So we have over 40 people that span a whole diverse background. It's not just imaging. And the whole reason I set this up is that there seems to be a pretty big hurdle for your first paper. And I remember that it was very daunting. It's a lot different than writing a thesis. And with that, I want to kind of just jump into where we are at. So like, why do you want to write a paper? So part of it is career advancement. Even at the technical level, most institutions, and we'll have a question about this, will actually value papers and publications. There's also the self-satisfaction of basically being able to share your work. It also helps others, especially, we're talking here more about technical papers, is sharing like a new technique or basically a modification of a technique that you found that really helps. And again, I'm going to make this as basically technology independent as possible. You're also helping to advance the field, right? You're sharing knowledge that maybe only you have about this new technique that could either basically improve the results or be more efficient or run cheaper. So what are the goals of the technical paper? And actually, before we do this, I'd like Ken to put up basically the next poll.
One second. Sorry about that. Hopefully everyone can see that. Please take a minute to respond.
Okay, give it about 30 seconds or so, and then just if you could put it up. Okay, that's very good. So everyone kind of would like to do this, and we all see the reasons for it. So what are the parts? So the purpose is to communicate new knowledge, and the new knowledge is to be clear there, right? And we're going to talk a bit about reproducibility, and because it is very important. So the audience, so you're targeting, researchers, future students, and the golden rule I like to say when I'm, basically helping my students and my postdocs write this is write it for the reader, not for yourself. So what does that really mean? That means that you may have knowledge that going into this that you don't realize that other people don't have, right? So maybe you've run this protocol or you've done this imaging so many times is you can often forget the little steps or the parts to that other people may not be aware of. So it's very critical that you write it for the reader and not just something that kind of intrinsically. And we get that. And this is also one of the places where if you partner with somebody, and I guess I should have said, is the volunteers here, I think they're all ABRF members, and they're doing this basically, there's no cost involved in it or anything like that. We're doing this basically to pay it forward. So they can also help you with this because they're not going to be as intimately familiar with what you're doing. So they can make suggestions. It's like, well, you're going from A to B, but it seems like that there should have been something in between A and B. So rigor and reproducibility, we've all heard about this, right? This has been in the headlines. There's, all kinds of, action items for this, NIH, NSF, everyone is doing this because it's so important. And there are so many, papers out there that basically say it's hard to reproduce, these scientific papers, and they give the statistics and stuff. And I'm not going to put those papers up there, but there is a lack of reproducibility. So when we look at the four elements of this, is one which people often overlook is the rigor for prior research. It's like, don't pretend that you've invented something that has already been out there. So, doing the literature search and having the references is very important because we're trying to build on what already exists, right? And then there's the rigor for the proposed research. It's like, again, you want to have the thought process and work through that this is novel, right? Or that you're adding something to it. Then, three is the biological variables. We're going to talk a little bit about this later in terms of certainty versus uncertainty, because especially on your first paper, it can be a little daunting that, you have everything perfect and you have no basically variability in it. And then authentication is basically the acknowledgments and going forward with that. So these are the expectations, or at least these are my expectations, that basically that it's reproducible, right? That you've put enough detail in there in the methods and materials that another researcher can basically reproduce it and get the exact results. And I believe that the peer review process is very important because this is where, outside of what we're talking about here, having people assist you in writing it, this is where you have other researchers in that field basically review it and say, yeah, this is sound, or that, you missed this reference or you missed that. And I have found that the peer review actually makes the paper or the article actually better because we've had a second set or third, fourth set of eyes look at it and come at it maybe from a slightly different perspective. And it is usually blind. And I have found in general, I've reviewed for over 20 different publications, is that people truly do want to improve the paper. They're not out there, and this is not 100%, but most times they're not out there to cause you agita or problems or try to prevent you from the paper. This is what I talked about before when we were talking about variables. Aim for a degree of confidence rather than complete certainty. So what does that really mean? Is uncertainty is inherent in all scientific knowledge. And researchers and in the paper, you need to understand the uncertainty and the association that is with the findings that you have. So what is this? So often this may be the N. So I encourage all of my students and postdocs and anyone working in my lab to first figure out basically through the equations is what a reproducible number would be for N. And that sometimes varies and it has to do with noise and stuff like that. But you're never, and you have to understand this, is that you're never going to have 100% certainty. And, you need to acknowledge some of that in the paper. And as long as you do that, then you're being honest and you're being forthright with what, the data actually represents. So what are the phases? Where do you start? How does this whole process take place? First is the message. You need to identify the single most important thing that you want people after they read this paper to remember and to understand and to hopefully implement. Target the journal early. And the reason that I put this in here is there's a whole host of different types of journals. They have all different requirements. They have different requirements in terms of the figures, in terms of color versus black and white, into how much you can have in the methods and materials. What you don't or want to try to avoid is specifically writing in a style and then submitting to a journal where that style is not appropriate. And we'll talk a little bit about references, but I'm talking here outside of the references even for that. Know where you want to submit this. And it's not saying that you're never going to have to submit it to a different journal. That happens, especially if you go, like I've submitted papers to Science and they reject it and then I publish it somewhere else. So you do have to sometimes do that. But at least in the very first round is try to target it specifically to a journal, and the instruction to authors really will detail all of this out, right? So sometimes, there's supplemental material. Different journals handle how the supplement material is handled. So just be aware of all of that when you start. And then the data. So you need to ensure that your experiments are complete before you start writing. So what I often see is that people get really excited. They have this novel idea and they start writing immediately with, no replicates, really low N. And I just tell them, okay, let's just pump the brakes here a little bit. Let's be sure that what you are proposing actually holds up to the rigor, right? To multiple ends, maybe different, trials and so forth. So you need to kind of pause there a little bit. So what's the anatomy of the paper? And we're going to leave the abstract for a little bit later. So the introduction, which I would say is probably where you should first start, is this is where you introduce the problem, but it's also where you do your literature, right? Again, unless you're Einstein or something like that, and you've come up with a completely novel idea that no one else has ever thought about, and there's no relevant, research on it. This is where you're going to introduce that, right? You're going to basically say, okay, this is the state of the art. This is where basically these findings normally occur. This is what other people have found, that type of stuff. Then the methods, and I'm going to be a huge champion on the methods. Now, part of it does come from my background in imaging, is we find that people are very reluctant to put great detail into the methods, and they basically almost skip over the section and they're just very brief. For rigor and reproducibility, the method section is critical, right? Because this is where you're detailing for the next person exactly how to reproduce this experiment. And if you leave out key details like the model of the equipment that you were using, or the software version, or where you got these specific antibodies or chemicals, this is where a lot of the rigor and reproducibility fails. So it's very important. And again, different journals handle this differently. Some of the top tier journals basically make you put a lot of that into the supplemental materials. but it really varies. But it's still, no matter where you put it, whether you put it directly in the paper or you put it in supplemental, is you should really be as detailed as possible about this. And I encourage everyone who works in my lab to maybe even be a little bit more detailed than maybe is absolutely necessary. But I find that that really increases the rigor and reproducibility. Now, the results. This is basically what you found, right? This is, you did X, Y, and Z, and you got A, B, and C. So this is, again, not speculation. This is hardcore, right? This is, we did this experiment. These were the metrics. This is what we found. So don't try to, start to speculate in the results. And the discussion is, this is where you discuss what these results mean, right? What this finding actually means, and what bearing it has on the state of the art for that literature. Okay, so in the second slide where I said I cringe a little bit at the title of my first paper, is you do want to kind of have a compelling title. Now, don't be Madison Avenue with this. Don't try to be really, catchy and stuff. But you do want to basically catch the reader's eye, and you don't want super long titles if at all avoidable, right? Because this is really the first thing that somebody's going to see, whether they're doing a literature search or however they're finding this paper. So make it as concise and as succinct as possible. So the best practices are, to avoid things like I did, like, studies of, and again, I made this, agnostic, optimizing lithium battery life, so basically you're kind of giving the reader an idea of what the paper is going to be about. So I said that we were going to talk a little bit more about the abstract later. I left that out, and I suggest that you write this last, because if you write this first, I think that you're kind of doing it backwards. So what the abstract is supposed to be is, like I put up there, as the movie trailer, right? This is basically gives you the highlights of the paper. And it usually includes a little bit of the history. It's like, researcher A, B, and C found this. We found that by adding C and D, we can improve the process. So you want to state the problem, the objective, how you did it, basically the main results and the conclusion. And this is where the challenge comes in, is most abstracts have to be 250 words or less. Some are as few as 150. So this is where you have to be very concise. You don't want to be wordy. You want to try to remove as many extra words as possible, but still convey basically what the paper, why it was written, what it's about, and what the findings were. So especially in the beginning, if you haven't written a lot of abstracts, this can actually be a really daunting thing to get it down. I find to get it down to, especially if you have to get it down to 150 words. Okay, the introduction. So I told you we're going to go back through this. So in the introduction, you want to start fairly broad. It's like, what's the general field saying about this process or this experiment or this procedure? Then you want to narrow it down and basically say, okay, well, on this specific application of this procedure, then you want what we call the hook, or what I call the hook. And again, these are mostly all my words, so I mean, I take full responsibility for them. The hook is basically to get the reader to see why this is important and why to continue reading, right? So that's basically is where it's your opportunity to say, hey, you should care about this because of. And then basically, what your contribution, what you're going to do, what you're bringing to new to this field and to this application. So methods and material, again, we can call this the recipe. I'm going to focus a little bit about this because I think that people tend to minimize this. They tend to gloss over some very important parameters that are needed for the rigor and reproducibility. So the main goal is to provide enough detail that another researcher can reproduce this work exactly. So this needs to include a lot of different things. And again, depending on the discipline, depending on the experiment, these are not all of them. And, this list would be huge if I tried to include every possible thing that should be in the methods and material. But basically, again, it goes back to what the goal is to allow a researcher that's not in your lab to basically reproduce your work. And these are just a couple of things, the equipment, software versions, models that you use, whether it be AI or something else, and the statistical tests that you're using to do that. So now the style, this varies from journal to journal, is how this is written. And again, this is why I suggest that you start with a specific journal in mind so that you don't have to basically change this. So it's usually written in the past tense. Be precise, be concise, but can include enough data that it's reproducible. And you can gather by now that I keep hitting this reproducibility because it is very important, and it has been lacking in the past. So one of the questions I often get about is presenting math and equations. In my field, especially in analysis, we often have a lot of, math, and in other fields do too, is you want to use a standard typesetting practice. So, you can find this, you can Google it, it's going to be specific to yours, but basically don't try to get cutesy with this and don't try to invent something that doesn't exist in terms of how you're representing formulas, how you're representing explanation, any of that type of stuff. Because you want this to be able to be understandable by people who maybe aren't intimately familiar with you, but are recognized how this is normally done in their field. And again, this is somewhat field specific, especially when it comes to constants and stuff like that. When it comes to some Greek nomenclature, again, it's going to be specific to your field, but follow what your field does. Now, the results, again, you're just reporting what happened, what metrics came out, any statistical tests you did to prove your difference from, a control, or from different populations, or from known standards, something like that. Really without a level of interpretation, but this is where your statistics would be, right? You're going to say that, okay, group A and group B were different with a p-value of such and such, right? And if you don't understand some of the statistics, be sure that you're using the correct statistical test for what you're asking, right? Or what you're trying to define. When I review papers, I often find that people are not using the correct statistical test. And I have to tell them, guess what? A one-way ANOVA was not the way to analyze that. You should have been using a student t-test. I mean, that's just a random example. But again, make sure you're using the statistical test that's appropriate to determine the answer to what you're trying to prove or disprove. So you want to organize it so that it matches your method section so people can kind of follow along. And you also want to point the reader to the most important trends in your data. So, you may have a lot of different metrics. When we look at, genetic tests and basically heat maps, they're very complex. And especially, if this is kind of your first time or you're really trying to do this, point your reader to what you think is the most important part of that. And we're going to talk in just a second about figures. So visualizing your data, your figures. This is, again, something that can be very daunting. It's like, okay, well, what type of figure do I use to represent this data to show what I want it to do? So one thing which I always insist, and even when I'm reviewing, I insist that is your figures and tables should stand alone. So basically, your figure legend should explain enough of the figure, whether it's a chart or whether it's whatever it is, a graph, that they don't have to go trying to search in the paper to figure out what that figure actually means. And this is really important. And again, this applies to tables, figures, whatever. And try not to get real cutesy. I always hate that if you only have two variables on, a bar graph, you don't need to use color, right? And, some of these 3D bar graphs can be even more confusing to read. If you don't need it, try to go with Joachim's, rule with the simplest is the best. So, like Excel and GraphPad and stuff like that, they can generate these really complex figures. Often they're not needed. Also, again, you want to have looked at what the journal requires for your figures and tables, whether they require, and this is somewhat, imaging based, does it require 300 DPI TIFF? Because if you submit JPEGs, it's going to immediately be rejected. And, there's other things like that for other disciplines about, if you're looking at a heat map, well, guess what? It has to be big enough so that you can actually see what you're talking about. And this is another thing, is like the legends need to be readable. So I often see that they shrink the figure down so much is that I can't even read what the legends are, right? So I have no idea what the values on X and Y really are. And I often will send it back and say, you have to make these bigger, excuse me, or you have to redo it so that that's actually viewable. Okay, the discussion. This is the point where you get to really tell the reader what you think that you have proven or at least elucidated and compare it to previous studies. And this is your opportunity to also say, in researchers A, B, C study, I've found a different result. And that's okay. And explain any abnormalities or unexpected findings. So this is an opportunity where you really want to be honest. You can say, in this protocol, step 3 is really critical because when I didn't, have it at 60 degrees C, where I only had it 50, it did fail. So this is where you bring basically context to some of your results and some of your methods and materials, where you basically emphasize what is really crucial. And it's like, and maybe at 50 degrees you found something different, right? So again, this is an opportunity where you can kind of not only explain what you've done, why you've done it, and maybe some off results from it. And people are reluctant to basically say that they failed at something or they did this and it failed. I kind of take the opposite view of that. Is like, if you overall everything worked, but you found a gotcha, put that in there so that people are aware of that. When I'm reviewing a paper or something, I don't see any negativeness to doing that, and I think it does help the person that's trying to reproduce it. And then one of the last things that you want to do in the discussion is so what and future work, right? Is like, okay, so this is why this is important, but I think that we should do something different to expand on this, or these are the things that I would do going forward to further analyze or further study this. And it gives the opportunity to set up for what you're going to do in the future, or lead people to do it. Because remember, this is about science, right? This is about sharing, it's about knowledge, it's about building on the shoulders of others and driving the whole science forward. So limitations, and I can't stress this enough, is you need to be honest, right? Know what your study didn't cover and acknowledge the constraints. So this is, remember we talked about being absolutely certain. This is the, where you basically are honest and say, and again, I'll do this with, like, let's say genetics in mice, because this is something I also work on. We only did this in B6 mice. Could be that in bowel mice it's going to be different. And be transparent, right? So it shows that you understand the scope of your work, and that basically what you're acknowledging what you can say and what you can't. And then obviously future work, this suggests next steps, basically where to go in the future, how to build upon this for the next paper, whether it be yours or whether it be somebody else's. The conclusion, this is basically, and not all papers have a conclusion, some do, some don't, depends on the journal, is basically you're going to just summarize basically and bring the reader back to the main point. It's very simple. And then the significance, and you don't want to introduce new data at this point. Everything should have been done. This is more of a summary. A lot of papers don't do this. A lot of this can be included in your abstract, but I put it in here because some journals and in some papers they do require it. So acknowledgement and funding, you want to be honest to basically acknowledge the people who were not authors. Their contribution didn't raise to that, but that helped, especially core labs. So if you got all the sequencing done, acknowledge the sequencing lab. because it doesn't hurt. And, if you had statisticians help you with it or do your stats, acknowledge them. And then the money. It's really crucial, especially in this day and age, to acknowledge if it was grant funded, where those sources came from, and it also avoids any perceived or real ethical conflicts. So most journals now require you to do a COI or a conflict of interest statement, but it's just good practice to do that. And then, the references. So this is basically where you're going to cite previous work that was related to what you've done. And there's all different types of citation managers. I highly suggest that you use a citation manager. I had the opportunity, I was substitute teaching in a public school and in their science research program, and I got the kids to use one of the free research uh, citation managers, and they just thought it was wonderful. It makes it a lot easier, and everyone kind of handles it a little bit differently. And again, which one you use really doesn't matter. I mean, I use one specific because my organization pays for it, right? But there's free ones out there. They all have kind of different pluses and minuses. And when I explained to the class, I also use the reference manager because it basically links to the PDF file, so I can basically just click on button and the PDF comes up. I also use it for the notes so that I can quickly search through my references and find, oh, okay, this is the paper that talked about that, and I want to cite that. And some of the reference managers, like if you're working in Word, you can actually directly import it and it will produce your reference list based on a specific criteria for what the journal wants. And the journals usually will be very specific about what they want for a reference format. Okay, Ken, can you put up the next poll? Give everyone about 30 seconds. And when you think most people are done, Ken, you can put it up. So again, the large majority find that having somebody to help them, not as a reviewer, but in basically in preparing it would be very beneficial. And I'm assuming the people that say no are people who probably have extensive experience at this and really don't need that. And I won't call anybody out. So in terms of the writing style, clarity is king, right? You want it, use short, simple sentence, avoid complex grammar, use complex science, right? So I see people that try to get very fancy, I'll say fancy with their grammar and stuff like that. Don't do that. Make it simple, make it straightforward. Let your science be what people focus on, not trying to figure out what the sentence means. So again, this different journals are different on this. Figure out what the preference is, whether they want active versus passive, so that you don't have to go back and completely rewrite your article. And try to replace these real fluffy type sentences. I give the example here because there's really no benefit to it, and it sometimes will annoy the reader, and it also dilutes the science, right? Because you don't want to get them caught up in the verbiage. You want them to get caught up in the science. Ethical considerations. This is very important. When I teach, we spend a whole lot of time, especially because of imaging, about data, cherry picking examples that fit your hypothesis. Plagiarism, always, give credit to the sources. It's like kind of where the references come in. But especially in the data, be sure that what you're putting in there, that figure is representative. It's not, you did this 1,000 times and this only occurred once and you're putting that in there. Because again, this goes back to rigor and reproducibility. It should be representative, not cherry picked. So authorship, this is often, and different labs and different institutions have different rules about this. So this is what I'm going to stand on, and what my lab does. Only includes those authors who made substantial intellectual contribution. Honorary authorship, I believe, is unethical, right? So what do I mean by substantial intellectual contributions? So this is people or that actually have participated in and are fully knowledgeable of what this paper and what this project is about. The statistician that basically you gave them a bunch of data and you said, I need to do a one-way ANOVA, or I need an R squared analysis on this, your multivariate experiment, PCA, whatever, they should be in the acknowledgments, right? Unless, and this isn't unless, that basically this was an iterative process with the statisticians, is like that they went back and forth and that they understood the biological or chemical or the actual scientific question being asked. But this is, again, I'm going to put the caveat. This is my perspective on this. Different labs, different institutions have very different views on authorship. And it is a very uh, hot topic, I would say. So this is the typical submission process. Some places you need to write a cover letter. I would say actually most of them do, that goes with your article. It should go out for peer review. And this is an opportunity for people that are in your field, not in your lab, to basically read the paper and say, yeah, you know what? This makes sense. They've done it correctly. I get the same conclusions that they get based on the data, based on the analysis. Or, I would think that, they should do this, or, this experiment, this additional experiment would bring more validity to it, or make it more believable. And that's where the revisions come in, right? So they can be major or minor. In terms of, they could require additional experiments, or they could just be, well, I think that you should reorder this, or you should do this one additional test, or something like that. And then there's the decision. And the decision, even if the paper, you disagree with the peer review, when you go back to your editor, you can explain to them, it's like, well, I disagree with reviewer 3 on this point because of this. And their editor will look at that and will take it into consideration, because it's very rare. It's like, I've never seen it where in the peer review there's only one reviewer. Ideally, there's 3. Sometimes there's more. And the reason that that's done is so that, the editor, who may not be an expert in that field, can kind of judge whether, well, if most of those reviewers are hammering on this same point, then it's probably valid. If one of them has basically made this huge deal about something that the other 2 never even mentioned, well, maybe that's a particular to that person, or that's how they would do it, but not necessarily the only way. So when you get those reviews back, it's important to read them in their entirety and not read them just as individuals, because you want to get a sense of what, as a group, they're saying about the paper, right? And what they think that revisions are needed. And again, this is your opportunity. If you disagree with one of the reviewers, you can go back to the editor and say, I changed A, B, and C, but, D, I don't feel that it was necessary, and this is why. And the editor often will basically side with you, especially if it's only one of the reviewers make a big point of that. And then you'll get the decision, right? Where it usually, if you've met all of the criteria in the revisions, it should be accepted. If you've said, no, I'm not going to do those experiments without really an explanation, it could get rejected. You basically, if once you've done, the revision and stuff, you resubmit it. And then again, it's a process. And even if it's rejected from one journal, and I will put my hand up, I've had papers rejected, one rejected from Science. You submit it to another journal. It's, this again is when you're selecting the journal, be very cognizant of what you're presenting. Is this something that, is going to make the nightly news? Then yeah, it's going to go into Science or Nature or Cell. But if this is just basically an improvement on a technology or something like that, be realistic about what journal you're submitting it to. It can save you a lot of heartbreak, and it can also save you a lot of time. So basically get a feeling for how novel, how important, how global. Is this a paradigm shift or is this just a slight modification when you're picking the journal? And then this is the final checklist. Does the abstract meet the final results? This is why I suggest you write the abstract at the end when the paper is completely done so that you avoid having a mismatch. All the figures, are they clearly labeled? Can you read everything in them? Is the formatting consistent throughout? This comes down to, like how are figures cited in the paper? Is that consistent? Have you proofread it or have other people proofread it for typos and for technical stuff? I always have somebody do that. And all the references accurate, right? So I'm going to say something here which may not be very well received, but with AI, and you can now generate basically entire papers, entire references, at the click of a button. And there's been plenty of examples out there from law on down where the citations may be completely made up. So please don't use AI to generate, your references. Do the due diligence. Go actually search, PubMed, however you want to do it. Find the papers, read them, and put them in there so that you're not embarrassed, right? Because it's one thing, especially now, is I check the reference and make sure that those are real, right? And I will say I have come across at least one paper where they must have used AI because they had a couple references in there that absolutely didn't exist. So again, you can use ChatGPT, you can Gemini, all these things to write papers. But I believe universally now is, and Ron can correct me, but we use checkers to see if it's completely AI. And there's very easy ways to do this. So this is done so that you're actually writing the paper, right? So you're not just basically putting a couple keywords, maybe a few results, and having whatever AI model you want generated. So please be accurate, be honest, and actually write the paper. So what's next? So this is where JBT can help. And this is where I gave you the punchline in the very beginning. We have over 40 people who have volunteered across all kinds of disciplines to partner with you at different stages of the paper and provide different levels of help, different types of help. If you're not sure if you have a story, if you need help getting started, if you're unsure about the analysis, you're having trouble with either creating the figures, determining what type of figures, how many figures you need. I often see that from especially my students is they'll have a ridiculous number of figures. They'll figure that everything that they say they have to have a figure for, and that's absolutely not true. You want to have figures that represent your points that you're trying to make, not basically cover every single thing. So, like I said, we have over 40 professionals. Most of these are people kind of like me that have extensive experience, so they can partner with you and help you. And so, what does this look like? So, basically, if you're interested in doing this, we have a list of people with their disciplines and with their specialities. Is contact me, and we'll match you up with somebody who's close to your field, and it may take a little bit of iteration because not everyone's going to have time at any specific time to help you. So we may have to, go through a few of them, and you can start working together. And I believe that this, and the reason I started this, I believe that this will help a lot of people really get started. Maybe some of the more junior people and people who are a little bit intimidated about the process and are unsure and they're afraid of making a mistake. They're afraid of getting that paper rejected. They don't want to do that. So having this ability to have somebody help you and say, yeah, you're on the right track, or I would do this, or have you thought about that? Or maybe this other experiment would help to substantiate what you're doing. That's kind of the help here. And the expectation is very low on basically the person's helping you. They're not expecting to be an author. And again, this will change again, depending on how much input they have, especially if it's IP, if they're putting in, intellectual thing into this, but that's not the goal. We're not trying to get on an additional paper. What we're trying to do is pay it forward. We're trying to help people basically produce and get those first papers out. And now I'm going to pass this over to Ron. He's going to talk specifically about JBT. And I'm going to stop sharing and let Ron take it away. And I guess I should say, because I don't think Ken said it, is we will have the recording of this, and I will also share my slides. They'll be mailed out to all the recipients, because I do understand that there was a little bit of differences in the time that this was supposed to be held. But you'll be able to get all the slides and the video.
Hey, everybody. Can everybody hear me and see me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, thank you, Rich, for that introduction to JBT. And yeah, JBT is the Journal of Biomolecular Techniques, which is the official journal of ABRF. So if you're listening to this, ABRF is a great place to publish. Forever ago when I was first publishing my first paper, I'm just going to partly answer a question that was published in the question thing. How do you pick a journal? Well, there was a handful of journals which I read. You actually had the paper copies of it sent to the lab, read through those. Usually I could emulate those, and those are the kind of papers which I wrote. Now, compliments of the internet. Most people don't read the paper copies. They read, the online versions of it. And to me, if you can publish in a journal which is available online to you and to the rest of the community, then that's a plus. And yeah, I really have kind of, there's the science and the natures, prestige, we're up on the higher end. But now I'm like, for about the past 10 years, it's like, well, any journal that's online and, treats me nice, it's like, I'm just going to publish in there. So I briefly wanted to hit some of the academic publishing models just to kind of give you a feel for this and why I think JBT is a great place to publish. So the traditional model is a subscription model where, it's kind of like, oh, I've got the subscription to this journal, or your library has a subscription to this journal. This is great. I want to write, an article for it. You wrote an article, you submitted it to the editors or however, and they had it reviewed just like Rich said, and they said, great, we'll eventually publish it. The advantage of this is that the authors don't need to pay for it. But the contents are closed access, and that people who don't have a subscription can't see that work. And if you really think about this, the object of you writing a paper is to share it with as many people as possible. This is really cutting people off, because it's like, no, there's a bunch of people that can't read it. Particularly if you start, start thinking about some journals were charging, $5,000 to $10,000, for an annual subscription, and a lot of places don't have access to that. Okay, nice thing is the articles don't, authors don't have to pay for it. And then something which I'm just going to touch on really briefly is that, the copyright. And if you're a grad student, for instance, and you write an article and send it off to Science, Nature, whatever like that, they now own the copyright for that. So when you go to include it in your dissertation, you can't include it because it's already copyrighted by Nature, whoever. So you need to get permission from the publisher to actually include it in your dissertation or to do anything else with it. In theory, you shouldn't be using the slides in your talks. Okay, this has now led to this open access movement. And for when I took over being editor of JBT, I was like, oh, JBT is open access. And I really thought this is what we were. And open access is kind of cool because it now lets, once it's published, it goes out there and anybody who has an internet connection can see it. So it's kind of cool because anybody can read it. And usually the license, JBT is now changing this, is that the copyright is retained by the authors. So what the authors do when they go to publish this in JBT, for instance, is that they give JBT/ABRF a license to use that, to publish that for as long as, forever. But the authors retain that, which is, kind of cool. Okay. Now this, you may have seen this pop up in the literature. But one of the issues with open access is that these publishers need to make money somehow or another. So NIH is now saying like, yeah, wait, we can't let you just charge an infinite amount of money to do this. And the example they cited was that if you submit a paper to Nature, Nature is going to charge you $12,000 to publish that. This gets kind of weird because, in my mind, being the researcher, this is taking what used to be covered in overhead costs, so that 50%, 100% overhead, which the University of Georgia takes off of my grants, and now says, yeah, we're not going to spend that on library fees because you're going to do open access stuff. And it now puts that into a direct cost for me. So that if I want to publish this, it's going to be $12,000. Yeah, it's like for many respondents, the NIH is proposing, that they cap this at $2,000 to $6,000 an article. And it's kind of interesting that this is published in Science, because Science actually charges close to $6,000 per article to publish there as well. So at the top end of that. So yeah, you can publish anywhere you want to, but this is going to limit some people. I know, core facilities don't often have $6,000 every time they want to publish a paper. So here comes JBT. So I learned this today as I was doing the research for this. JBT is what's called a Diamond Open Access Journal, and that's that it's free for readers and for publishers, so authors. And the entire support for JBT comes from ABRF. So this is kind of cool. Disadvantage for this is that we kind of run on a shoestring budget. We can't be the big, fancy publishers with all the ads, and we can't go and have a booth we could have a booth at ABRF, but to attract more articles. But it is free and perfect for core labs. So at this point, I actually we've undergone a lot of changes. I actually wanted to go to the website. So if you looked at JBT before like November, you would have seen a very different website. We've now transitioned over to a site that looks like this. So it's jbt.abrf.org. It was at PubPub for a little bit. This is the site. It's live. If you scroll down at the main thing, you'll see that here's a list of articles. And remember, this is articles. The content of these articles don't have to fit the traditional science model where it's like, oh, I found this neat new discovery, or oh, I came up with this new approach, or I modified this approach. It can be things like this, doing surveys. What's the effect of the policy shifts, i.e. funding levels, on shared resources? Kind of scroll down a little bit more. Incentivizing. So how can we incentivize people to use cores? Article Watch, which I'm going to take a sidelight on Article Watch. If you, like me, don't have the time to keep up with all the articles in your field because there's a million journals going on and articles being published, Clive Slaughter, who's an associate editor for JBT, actually looks through and he finds what he thinks are the why is this not working now? Of course, because I'm looking at it. There we go. So if you actually look through it, I won't do this because it's a weird one. But anyway, he goes and summarizes some of what he thinks are the coolest articles which are available. And then you get down here and you do actually see what you would consider science articles. So let's just hit one of these, and I pick the top one just for fun. Okay, what's this actually look like? So here we have the abstract. It looks like it's professionally done. Here's the introduction and background and things like that. Here are the references. Okay, as was being pointed out by Rich with the AI checker. So the references, not only do we include the reference, but it also includes a DOI number, which takes you there, or a Google Scholar. So you can now hop straight to the Google Scholar. So if AI is generating weird references for you, it's not going to be in Google Scholar and you're going to be in trouble. Okay. You can also, if you want, download these. Save article, download as a PDF. I've already done this. And again, it looks like, and you can save this and you read it later if you want. If you do publish, okay, let's go backwards. No, this doesn't have any figures in it. Oh, there we go. It has a few figures. So the figures in the PDF obviously are small and maybe hard to read unless you zoom in. And the resolution is not too bad. But if you look at the figure on the website, see if I can find it, it's actually fairly good. Okay, that's probably enough about articles. Let's go back. Okay, information, so issues, if you hop here, this is the 30, we're on our 37th issue. Get back to issue, you can see everything published in 2025. Scroll all the way back to 1999. So all the content is now here. Okay, the important part, we'll just hit for authors. So here's where all those instructions are. So who has a copyright, everything is peer reviewed, cover letter, article types. We have long format, perspectives and reviews. We've had, well, one on the, anyway, you'll see lots of things. Technical notes, if you think that you want to write a technical paper, but it's shorter than what you would think a full technical paper should be, we have these technical notes. Commentaries, more for senior people. Rapid communications, again, fairly short articles. Tutorials. So Rich published one of these on some aspect of light microscopy, if you want to do that. Okay, manuscript preparation, lots of scientific terms, everything that, pretty much anything that you want to find out is here. If you have a question about this, please send me an email or Sheena. That we're in transition and we added some of the article types recently. So we probably need to modify this a little bit, but anyway, it looks reasonably good. And if you actually want to submit a manuscript, literally it's hit the submit manuscript. Type in what your title is. Continue. Okay, title, cut, paste, title, article type. So you can do a research article. So all those article types, which I just mentioned there, just select one. Cut and paste your abstract, put your keywords in. Are you a member of ABRF, CTLS, etc.? And then when you get to leave, and I don't care. Now you just upload your manuscripts is docx or PDFs. Additional files, so if you think supplementary files, you can put as many supplementary files as you want. These can go anywhere from images to, we even allow videos. Anyway, that's about it for JBT. Again, I'm going to go back and claim that the benefit of this is that if your goal is to share your results or your new technique, your modification of your technique with the scientific community as a whole, why not pick the free way to do this through JBT? And it still gets out onto the internet and it still shows up. And if I do like a Google Scholar search, which is where at least I go and look for articles. Scholar, okay, Journal of Biomolecular Techniques. We show up as Google Scholar searches. Here's the latest. Here's an article from the last issue. So this is already in there from December. So submitting to PubMed Central is just part of this, and it's not a requirement if you if you use grant money from NIH to deposit this articles here. So it shows up and it's all good and it's all free. And you have lots of people like me to help you out. And again, our reviewers, I tend to pick reviewers who I think will help you write and improve your manuscript. This is not a hurdle. We don't act like we're gatekeepers. We're really trying to take your article and make it better. And then you have people like Rich and his collection of people who will help you write it before you submit, and then the reviewers and I to try and get you to write it better after it's submitted. So that's about all I have to share. So I hope you learned something, and I hope you'll consider publishing in JBT.
Thanks, Ron. So before we go to questions, Ken has one last poll, and I probably should have done this earlier because we had tremendous drop off here. But this is more for just for all of us to see whether institutions value publications for promotion. So again, we'll wait about 30 seconds, and then Ron, I thank you for answering a lot of the questions in the chat while I was giving the webinar. I didn't even look at it, to be honest, but there is one that we will go over, and then we'll open it up if there's any other questions. Okay, so that's not surprising, is most places do view it, and that's why I think that this could really help a lot of people get off the ground with the publications. Okay, so one of the questions which I don't think was answered, where was it? Do you consider ideas that lead to upgrading the value of the paper as substantial intellectual contributions? So these are always very individual and very specific questions, right? So there's no general answer for this. So it depends on whether you feel that that was a substantial intellectual contribution. I guess that's the easiest way to say it. There's no formula that you can really put in. And different people will disagree on what that level is to become author. So it's something that if you're the author of the paper, if you're the first author or last author, this is something that is kind of up to you. Hopefully that answers the question. So are there any other questions that people have? You can either put it in the chat or you can raise your hand. I'm going to try to I don't think so. Like I said, is that Ken is going to email out the link for the slide PDF of the slides that I presented and that Ron presented, and also the recording of this, so that if you did miss it because of the time change or anything like that, you can have access to it. And both, my email is in the slides, and Ron put his in the chat, and I think it was also in the slides. So want to thank everyone, and I hope that this initiative really is beneficial for everyone out there. Thank you, and we will see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Ron. Thanks, everyone.
Hi,
Have a great
everybody.
day.